The prairie stretches endless under a bruised February sky, flat and white and unforgiving in every direction. 3 kilometers north of a small frontier town, a limestone bluff rises from the frozen earth like a knuckle of forgotten geology. A single wisp of wood smoke curls from a hidden fissure at its crown thin against the wind. At the base of that bluff, a cave mouth opens south into the rock, and inside its shelter, an oil lamp burns low on a plank table. A woman's hand rests flat against the cool limestone wall. Her wedding band catches the amber light. On the table beside her, a notebook lies open, its cracked spine turned toward a page of measurements written in a dead man's hand. The barometer on the wall trembles. Outside, the birds have gone silent. 3 days from now, 27 souls will be pressed into this darkness breathing. She has not yet opened the door. The sky over Ridge Hollow, Dakota Territory, on the 9th of February, in the year 1884, cracked open at 17 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, without warning of any kind that a person raised on this prairie would have recognized as sufficient. One breath earlier, the air had been merely cold, the flat gray cold of a stalled winter afternoon, unremarkable in a country that had learned to be unremarkable about its weather. One breath later, the world was no longer available. The wind arrived not as a gust, but as a wall, a shrieking mass of white driven horizontally from the northwest at a velocity no timber structure in the county had ever been asked to survive. Snow ceased falling and began attacking. The temperature dropped 22 degrees in the span of minutes, the kind of drop that outruns a man's ability to reach his own coat. But 3 kilometers north of the town, pressed into the limestone bluff that rose out of the flatland like a knuckle of forgotten geology, a woman stood at the mouth of a cave with an oil lamp in her right hand and watched the prairie disappear without moving her feet. The lamp's flame reached perhaps 4 feet into the white chaos before the chaos consumed it entirely. Behind her, pressed into the sheltered darkness of the inner chamber, 27 people breathed. Some slept the shallow sleep of the recently rescued. Some prayed the specific prayers of people who had already used up the loud ones. A few simply stared at the cave floor with the hollow eyes of those who had run out of language before they ran out of ours. The temperature inside the cabin she had built into the hollow held at 17 degrees Celsius. The small cast iron stove in the corner burned a single piece of oak. Hester Ainsworth looked at the storm for a long time. Then she turned to walk back into the cabin, added nothing to the fire. The rock had already done its work. She lifted the glass chimney of the lamp and blew the flame out. Darkness settled over the interior like a held breath released slowly. In that darkness, she was not afraid. She had been afraid once deeply at the level of bone, but that had been 7 months back on a July morning in the Ridge Hollow land office, when she had pointed to a worthless piece of ground on a surveyor's map, and every man in the room had looked at her the way men look at something they pity but have not yet decided whether to correct. The Dakota summer of 1883 had arrived like a punishment written in sun. The prairie stretched flat and merciless in every direction, from the town offering no shade, no apology, no shape a body could rest against. Ridge Hollow sat on that open ground with its 400 souls arranged around a single dirt main street, a general store owned by a widow named Hollis, a lumber yard, a saloon that never quite closed a one-room schoolhouse, a land office with white paint peeling from the doorframe in strips the shape of pared apple skin. It was a town that believed in itself with the uncomplicated certainty of a settlement that had not yet been tested by anything more serious than the ordinary hardships it had budgeted for. The land office smelled of old paper pipe tobacco and the specific sweat of men who had been sitting in one place too long on a warm morning. Mayor Silas Redmond sat behind a wide oak desk with a survey map spread between himself and the woman who stood across from him. To his left, occupying the room the way certain men are trained from birth to occupy rooms, stood Barnaby Thresh. Thresh owned the largest cattle operation in the county. He wore that fact the way other men wore a good hat, without ever seeming to remember it was there, which was the whole point. Hester Ainsworth stood with her back straight and her hands clasped in front of her. She was 34 years old, lean in the way of women who work outdoors without being paid for the working dark circles beneath her eyes that had settled in 20 months earlier and never departed. Her cotton dress had been washed too many times. Her boots had not. She had ridden 12 miles that morning on a borrowed gray mare, saving her own chestnut gelding Ember for the heavier hauling that lay ahead of her. The map showed every parcel of land available under the Homestead Act within 20 miles of Ridge Hollow. The good parcels, flat, dark-soiled, well-watered, were already claimed or priced beyond her reach. Her finger moved north of town and came to rest on a section marked in faint pencil, with a small notation Rocky Scrub Cave Formation on east face poor agricultural value. Redmond leaned forward over his spectacles. Thresh did not lean. He looked at the finger, then at the face above the finger with the patient amusement of a man watching a woman make a mistake he had already decided not to prevent. Hester's voice came out, even deliberate, without the small tremor that women in her situation were often expected to supply as a courtesy. "I want a file on that parcel." Redmond removed his spectacles and cleaned them, which was the gesture he used when he needed a moment to arrange his expression into something kinder than what it actually contained. "Mrs. Ainsworth," he began, and the use of the title carried its full weight, the weight of a recent widow of reduced means, filing on land that no man in the county had bothered to claim in 3 years. "That section has been on the books since '80, not a single inquiry. The soil won't support wheat. The grade is too steep for grazing anything above a handful of goats. There is, as you may have gathered from that notation, a rather significant hole in the side of it." Thresh's mouth pulled into an expression that was not quite a smile. "That hole is the only feature giving the parcel any character at all. You aimed a homestead in a cave, ma'am. This is 1883. We've got proper timber lots 3 miles east, good flat ground, reasonable price. Woman in your circumstance ought to be thinking practical." She looked at Thresh, the way she looked at a barometer without emotion, extracting only the information that was useful. "That hole is precisely why I want the parcel." Redmond put his spectacles back on. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who had decided that the most humane thing available to him was silence. He stamped the papers. The sound of the stamp meeting the desk was the sound of every person in that room, including Hester. Understanding that what had just happened would be discussed in Ridge Hollow for a long time, and not with sympathy. She took the papers, folded them into the inner pocket of her coat, thanked the mayor in the same tone she would have used to thank a clerk who had counted her change correctly, and walked out into the July heat. The door closed behind her with the small, clean sound of a decision that could no longer be revised. She rode north out of town in the amber light of late afternoon, when the prairie went briefly beautiful in the way it sometimes did before a hot night. The bluff rose out of the flat land at the 12th mile like something the earth had forgotten to finish flattening. The cave mouth faced south, 12 meters wide, 7.5 at the highest point of the arch, narrowing as it went back into the rock. The limestone was pale gray, bone dry, cool to the palm, even after a full day of July sun. She pressed her hand flat against it and held it there long enough to feel her own heartbeat register through her fingers. That night she sat with a small fire at the cave's mouth and opened the leather satchel she carried everywhere she went. Inside, beneath a rolled survey map of her own drafting and a folded letter she had never answered, was a notebook with a cracked spine and water-stained covers. The handwriting inside was not hers. It belonged to Josiah Ainsworth. The small, precise letters of a man who had spent 6 years writing measurements in the margins of technical documents for the Union Prairie Railway. Josiah had been good at his work in the quiet way that men who pay attention to what bores other people are good at their work. He had spent time in tunnels blasted through prairie stone, and what he had noticed there had exceeded what his employer required him to notice. He had written it all down. Limestone Formation, Western Sector, October 1879. Interior temperature stable at 12 to 14 degrees Celsius, regardless of exterior condition. Tested in summer heat. Tested in early winter freeze. The differential holds. The rock is not passive. It stores, it releases, it regulates. No constructed material behaves this way. A dwelling built inside such formation would require a fraction of the heating fuel required by any frame structure on open ground. The railway will not fund the study, filed for personal record. Hester had read those pages so many times she could recite them in a dark room without opening the book. She had read them first in November of 1881. The week after Josiah died in a tunnel collapse 40 miles west of the bluff she now sat above. She had read them again through the 20 months of working his surveying contracts under her own name, to pay down the debts he had left riding out in all weather, taking his measurements, signing where he could no longer sign. She had read them in the evenings when the grief had settled from something that cut into something that simply sat the way a stone in a boot, eventually stops slicing and becomes a companion. She had not come to this bluff because she had run out of better options. She had come because Josiah had been right, and no one had permitted him to prove it, and she intended to prove it for him. She closed the notebook, held it against her sternum for the length of one long breath, then put it carefully away. The fire had burned down to coals. The cave around her held the temperature of deep earth, indifferent to the summer night, indifferent to her private ceremony. She pulled her blanket tighter and slept better than she had in 20 months. The work began in the first week of July. She had mapped the plan across the winter of Josiah's notebook margins, adding her own notations in a different ink, the carpenter's calculations that were hers alone. She had learned those from her father, a Cincinnati furniture maker, who had run a small shop for 30 years before she was grown enough to be more useful to him than any apprentice he could hire. She knew wood grain joint tolerance, load distribution across an uneven surface. She knew how moisture moved through timber and what it did when it found nowhere to go. Her father had believed that a joint held for a century or not at all, and he had taught her accordingly without softening the standard for the fact that she was his daughter. The cave narrowed from 12 meters at the mouth to 9 meters at approximately 18 meters back. She marked the cabin's footprint 6 meters in from the entrance, deep enough that the exterior walls would never be touched by direct wind, close enough that the south-facing opening would admit the low winter sun while the high summer sun passed harmlessly overhead. This was not intuition. She had spent 3 evenings calculating the sun's arc across the 4 seasons, using methods Josiah had shown her at the kitchen table in the winter of '79, when he had still believed he had time. The cabin frame would measure 6 meters wide by 9 deep. The floor would sit 60 centimeters above the cave floor on stone piers. Her father's solution to moisture translated from Cincinnati wood shops to Dakota limestone. The walls would be double-planked with a 10-centimeter gap between the layers, and into that gap she planned to pack raw wool purchased at low cost from a sheep operation 15 miles south near the Republican River Fork. The insulating value of that construction would exceed anything being framed in Ridge Hollow's new houses. Though she did not have the language yet for the principle she was applying, only the certainty drawn from her father's practical instruction and Josiah's scientific observation that it would work. For heat, she budgeted $22 for a small cast-iron potbelly stove. She had already located a natural fissure in the cave ceiling, a vertical crack running all the way through to the bluff's exterior, through which she would route the flue pipe. That fissure would function as a chimney of superior quality to anything a mason could build by hand. The draw would be excellent. Creosote buildup would be minimal. She had climbed the bluff's outer face twice to examine the fissure from above, planning the fieldstone caps she would construct at its top to keep weather from finding entrance. She had arranged to purchase 12 ponderosa pine logs from a timber stand 16 kilometers northwest on the far side of a creek that ran low in July. Ember would haul them. It would take multiple trips. She had estimated the weight per load, the rest intervals the horse would need, the total days required. She had written all of it in the margin of Josiah's notebook, her small figures beside his 2 hands, meeting on the same page across the boundary that death had drawn between them. What she had not fully planned for was Micah Doverly. He appeared on the 3rd morning, standing at the cave entrance, with his hands stuffed into the pockets of trousers, a size too small. His hat pushed back on his head, in the way of a boy trying to look older than 15, without knowing precisely what a 15-year-old was supposed to look like. He was the son of a widow who ran the town's laundry, and he had apparently been dared by 2 older boys to come see what the Ainsworth woman was doing up on the bluff, and he had come, and now he was standing there with the particular stillness of a boy who has not yet decided whether he has made a mistake. Hester was measuring the cave floor with a surveyor's chain. She did not look up immediately. "You're the one building inside the rock." His voice cracked on the word rock and steadied afterward. "I am." "What for?" She finished the measurement, recorded it in her notebook, then straightened and looked at him directly. She had a way of looking at people that was neither unkind nor performative. She simply looked, assessed, spoke. "Because the rock will do half my work for me if I build in the right place. A frame house on open ground has to fight the weather every hour of every day. This won't have to fight anything." Micah considered this with the seriousness of a boy who had not expected the woman to answer him as though he were a person entitled to an answer. He looked at the cave wall, then at the measuring chain, then back at her. "My mother says you're going to freeze to death in there." "Your mother has not done the thermal calculations." He blinked. "What's thermal mean?" "It means heat. The rock holds heat in winter and holds cool in summer. Its interior temperature stays between 12 and 14 degrees Celsius year-round, regardless of what the sky is doing outside. I'll need a small stove to bring the cabin above that, but the rock does the rest of the work. I'll burn perhaps a quarter of the firewood that anyone in Ridge Hollow burns this winter." Micah was quiet for a moment. He had a quality rare in boys his age, the quality of actually processing information before he responded to it. "How do you know that?" She looked at him for another moment. Then she handed him the other end of the surveyor's chain. "Hold this at that mark on the floor and don't let it slip." He stayed all day. He came back the next morning without being invited. By the end of the first week, he was carrying tools without being asked, and she was explaining what she was doing without being asked. And the arrangement had organized itself into something neither of them had set out to construct. Timber hauling began in the second week. 12 logs, each 25 centimeters in diameter, each 6 meters in length. Ember made the first haul without complaint, in the way good horses handle hard work, not willingly exactly, but with a focused acceptance that made willingness beside the point. Hester walked beside him on the return trips, cooling him down, talking to him in the low, steady voice she used for horses and calculations, and grief, which was the same voice. The logs had to be shaped on site. She cut the mortise and tenon joints herself using her father's tools, a mallet, a set of chisels, a marking gauge, and a tri-square that had survived the move from Ohio in a canvas roll she kept at the bottom of her trunk. The precision she worked to was not the rough-cut precision of frontier carpentry. It was the close tolerance work of a man who had believed a joint held for a century or not at all and had taught his daughter accordingly. Micah watched her cut the first joint with the expression of someone watching a thing he had not known was possible. When the tenons seated into the mortise without gap, without wobble, with the quiet certainty of two pieces made exactly for each other, he let out a breath that was almost a word. "My father used to say a good joint is honest." She did not look up from her work. It doesn't need paint or nails to hide what it is. The walls rose through August. She planed the planks herself, 2 layers per wall section, inner and outer, with the 10-centimeter gap precisely maintained by wooden spacers she had cut to uniform length in a single afternoon. The wool went in after each frame section was set, packed at a density that would hold position without compressing so tight it lost the air pockets that gave the material its whole purpose. The smell of raw lanolin filled the cave for days, a smell that made the goats she would later purchase raise their heads and stare in a way she found funny only in retrospect. The stove arrived by freight wagon from the east on the 14th of August. The delivery man looked at where she wanted it taken 6 meters into a limestone cave to a timber frame that appeared to be a house but was not outdoors, and charged her an extra $1 without discussion. She paid it. The $1 was worth less than the argument would have cost. Running the flue pipe through the natural fissure took 3 days. The fissure was not straight. It angled slightly east before correcting, and she had to join 2 sections of pipe at a precise angle and wire them to the rock face to hold position against the pull of the draw. On the 3rd day, standing on the bluff's exterior with a bucket of mortar she had compounded from limestone dust and creek clay, she constructed the fieldstone cap over the fissure's upper opening. She had tested the mortar mixture 2 weeks earlier on a small section, confirming it would cure correctly in July heat. It held. The root cellar came last. At the back of the cave, where a vein of softer sandstone intruded into the limestone, she dug down 60 centimeters and widened the space to accommodate shelving. The temperature there measured a consistent 7 degrees, cold enough to keep root vegetables through a Dakota winter without freezing, without the moisture fluctuation that rotted cellars dug into open ground. She lined the walls with flat limestone slabs, the floor with gravel for drainage, built the shelves from off-cut timber with the same close tolerance joints she used for everything. The total cost, including the land filing fee, the timber purchase, the stove and its freight hardware wool mortar, and the small sundries a project of this scale required, came to $387. She had $391. The $4 margin sat in her purse for the rest of the summer, a thin, quiet cushion between her and nothing. Word traveled in Ridge Hollow at the pace of a town with nothing faster to occupy itself. But by the 3rd week of July, the cave project had become general discussion, which was to say it had become entertainment, which was to say the people of Ridge Hollow began riding out to the bluff on Sunday afternoons with the specific energy of citizens attending a spectacle they had already decided was going to fail. Barnaby Thresh came first because Thresh went first to most things in the county, and because he rode his best horse in the silver-trimmed saddle and liked to be seen doing both. He positioned himself at the cave entrance and looked down at Hester and Micah as they worked with the comfortable authority of a man reviewing something he had already judged. "I've got a barn, cost me $3,000. He pitched his voice slightly above what the distance required. 2 stories, pegged oak frame, finest animal shelter in the territory. My hands built it right on flat ground under open sky. He paused for the specific effect he had come to produce. You're building a $400 house inside a hole in a hill, ma'am. I've seen badgers with better real estate instincts. Hester was chiseling a tenon joint. She finished the cut she was on, blew the dust clear, set the chisel down. Mr. Thresh, when the next bad winter comes, I'll be warm. Come find me then and tell me about your barn. Something in Thresh's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the small closing around the eyes of a man not accustomed to being answered instead of accommodated. He rode away without adding to what he had come to say. The name he left behind him was forming on his tongue before his horse reached the bottom of the bluff. Thresh Hole. It was in the saloon by nightfall. Wendell Farrow came the following Sunday. He was a different order of problem. Farrow was the most respected builder in the county, a square-shouldered, deliberate man who had framed 30 houses across the territory, across 3 decades of work in new timber construction, with the confidence of accumulated correct decisions. He was not arrogant in Thresh's style. He was something more difficult to answer. How was a man who had been right so many times that he had stopped budgeting for what he might not yet know? He walked the cave systematically examining the framing, the flue pipe, the foundation piers. He said nothing for a long time, which was the professional version of gathering evidence before delivering a verdict. You've set your foundation post directly on bedrock, Mrs. Ainsworth. His voice carried the courtesy of a man who intended his correction to sound like counsel. There's no give. A structure needs to settle. The soil around it compresses, the frame adjusts. On solid rock, any differential movement in the timber and you get rack. The joints will open. The joints are cut to 0.5 millimeter tolerance. She kept her hands on her work. Mortise and tenon drawboard, they will not rack. His expression registered this claim with the patience of someone deciding whether to explain why it was wrong. And the flue arrangement, running pipe through a natural fissure. That's inviting condensation pooling, ice blockage in hard winter chimney fire in a space you cannot reach with a brush. The fissure is vertical for its full length except a 12-degree angle at 4 meters up, which I've addressed with a joined section wired to the rock face. The natural draft exceeds what any brick chimney of the same height would produce, and the large diameter above the pipe cap dissipates creosote gases before they concentrate. I spent 3 days testing the draw with smoke before I set the pipe. Farrow looked at her for a moment. He was not a man who dismissed female intelligence as a matter of principle. He was a man who had not yet been given reason to revise his prior model of what female intelligence was likely to contain, and he was encountering something for which he did not have a category. He adjusted by nodding slowly, which was what capable men did when they had not won an argument, but were not yet prepared to admit as much. It isn't how it's done, ma'am. He gathered the word ma'am around him like a coat. There are reasons things are done the way they are. There are. She had already returned to her chisel. Sometimes those reasons are still good. He left. The phrase he contributed to the town's vocabulary was more subtle than Thresh's. He told the man at the lumberyard that Hester Ainsworth was overthinking a straightforward problem, that there were perfectly serviceable timber lots available on flat ground with standard construction, and she had chosen to complicate herself for reasons a plainer approach would have spared her. The phrase caught pulling in Ainsworth. It entered the Ridge Hollow language within the week, applied to anyone who had constructed an elaborate solution to a problem that had not required one. Prudence Halloway was the hardest of the 3. She taught at the Ridge Hollow schoolhouse, and she taught well rigorously in the manner of women who had obtained education at some cost and defended it as a consequence. She held opinions about progress and civilization and the appropriate scope of women's authority in practical affairs, and she held them with the precision of someone who had thought them through and arrived at conclusions she believed were correct. Hester overheard her at the general store on a Thursday morning. Halloway was speaking to Mrs. Hollis at the dry goods counter, not loudly but not carefully enough either. She is a widow alone, which I understand, and I have every sympathy for the situation. But practical construction requires experience and engineering knowledge that one woman, however determined, simply cannot be expected to possess unaided. She ought to have consulted Mr. Farrow before she began. She ought to be consulting him now. The cave project is what happens when a woman in grief mistakes stubbornness for wisdom. Hester bought her flour and her salt and left without a word. She heard it, though, and it sat in her chest differently than Thresh's contempt or Farrow's professional dismissal. Thresh was easy to discount, He had never been wrong about anything because he had never permitted the question to be examined. Pharaoh at least engaged with the technical facts. Holloway had done something more refined. She had located the wound beneath the armor. Mistakes stubbornness for wisdom. She had not said it about the construction. She had said it about Hester herself, about the grief specifically, which was a place the other two had not thought to look. That evening, sitting at the cave entrance with a candle and Josiah's notebook open on her knee, she wrote in the margin beside his limestone temperature readings, in her small, careful hand, "They will not understand it until they need it. Until then, build." She built. Micah kept coming. By late August, he had stopped asking questions about what she was doing and begun asking questions about why. Why the piers were spaced at these particular intervals. Why the flue angled where it did. Why the wool and not straw, which was cheaper and closer. She answered each one, and she noticed after a time that his questions were arriving in a sequence that suggested he was building a model of the project in his head, a full one load-bearing, not the flimsy sketch a boy his age would ordinarily assemble. She did not tell him that she noticed. Praise offered too early to a young mind calcified into something unhelpful. She simply answered his questions and gave him more tools. By the end of September, the cabin stood complete inside the cave, 6 meters by 9, double-walled, stove installed, flue drawing clean, root cellar stocked with the first of the fall harvest she had bought from 3 separate farms south of town, paying cash for turnips, potatoes, carrots, cabbage, a wheel of dry cheese, a small barrel of salt pork. She had traded 2 months of survey work to a rancher near the Western Fork for 2 goats and had bought a milk cow at auction in mid-September for less than her calculations had budgeted. The $4 margin had grown in the last accounting of the season to nearly 19. She wrote the number in the notebook without comment and closed the page. They moved in on the 1st of October. Ember went into the stall she had framed at the back of the outer chamber, where the temperature would hold him steady through the winter without any of the cold weather ailments that had killed a neighbor's team the previous January. The cow went into the adjacent stall. The goats accepted their pen with the specific, unbothered efficiency goats brought to any change in their circumstances. She lit the stove for the first time that evening, feeding it 3 pieces of oak, and within 40 minutes the cabin temperature had risen from 13 degrees to 19. She let the fire die back to coals. The temperature settled at 17 and held there without further adjustment from her. She sat down in the chair she had built from off-cut timber. Not a beautiful chair, but a correct one, properly jointed, balanced on the uneven floor through careful shimming of the rear leg. She opened Josiah's notebook to the page she always opened it to first. The rock is not passive. It stores, it releases, it regulates. She put her hand flat against the limestone wall beside the chair and felt the cool, steady truth of it under her palm. The Dakota autumn turned hard through October in the way it did in years when the territory had decided to make a point. The first frost came in the second week. By early November, the households of Ridge Hollow were burning through their wood piles at the rate a prairie winter demanded from any frame structure standing on open ground, the wind finding every seam, every gap, where 2 boards had been joined by men who had not been paid to fuss over half a millimeter. Their stoves roared day and night to hold interior temperatures above discomfort. Hester's woodpile stacked neatly in the outer chamber, where the cool, dry air kept it seasoned, barely seemed to diminish. She was consuming by her own careful measurement less than 30% of what the average Ridge Hollow household consumed in the same period. Micah came out on a Sunday in late November, ostensibly to help her reinforce the goat pen, though she understood that he had come because he had become genuinely interested in the problem of the place, in why it worked in the distance between what it appeared to be from 100 yards down the road and what it actually was inside. He stepped into the cabin and stopped for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating a measurement against a fresh reading. "It's warm in here. 17 degrees, the stove has been out since morning." He put his hand on the wall the way she often did, though he did not know that. The rock was cool to the touch, noticeably cooler than the air in the cabin. His brow contracted. "But the rock's cold. The air's warm." "The rock is 13 degrees. The air is 17. The rock absorbed heat from last night's fire and is releasing it slowly. It's been doing this since the earth formed. I didn't invent it. I built in a place that already knew how." He was quiet for a long moment, working something through. "Why don't you tell people in town they're burning 3 times the wood you are?" She looked past him toward the cave entrance, toward the yellow lamplight visible on Ridge Hollow's main street, 3 kilometers south, small and bright against the darkening prairie. The cold was settling outside with the purposeful weight of a season finding its full range. They will not hear it from me. Not yet. A woman who builds in a cave does not get to explain things to people who have already decided what she is. They will understand when the weather teaches them. She turned back to the goat pen. Hand me that post, Maul. He handed her the maul. She set the post. The pine struck the rock floor and rang true. Outside, the wind picked up nothing unusual, nothing threatening, just the prairie reminding everyone within earshot that it was still there. The livestock shifted in their stalls. Ember snorted once and was still. Neither of them said anything more about the town. There was nothing more to say. The winter was still settling into its opening movements, working itself up to what it had eventually intended to become. And what it intended to become was something for which no one in Ridge Hollow, including Hester yet, had a full accounting. She had built for it. She had built on the evidence of rock and physics and a dead man's careful observations in a notebook with a cracked spine against the judgment of 400 people who had watched her work and decided she was a cautionary tale. Outside, the first fine snow began to fall, the ordinary kind, the kind that meant nothing yet. It gathered on the shoulders of Ember's stall gate. It settled on the fieldstone cap she had built above the fissure and slid off as she had designed it to. It moved across the prairie in the slow, steady way of weather that had not yet decided to be dangerous. Inside the cabin, the lamp burned steady. The limestone walls held their temperature with the unhurried certainty of things that had been doing one job for a very long time. Somewhere south in Ridge Hollow, a man was adding wood to a fire that would need adding to again in 3 hours. Hester banked her stove, checked the livestock, and went to bed. The rock kept its vigil around her, cool and constant, entirely indifferent to what the sky intended. The first ordinary snow of November gave way within a week to a stretch of weather that Ridge Hollow's older residents began describing as bracing, which was the word the prairie used when it meant something worse than cold, but had not yet committed to being dangerous. The temperature settled at 15 below zero for 6 consecutive days. Wagon wheels froze to the ground overnight in front of the general store. A trough at the livery cracked from the inside out when the water in it expanded past what iron could accommodate. Mrs. Hollis at the counter kept a small kettle steaming on her back stove and drank from it without ceremony. Throughout the day, her fingers going white around the tin cup between customers. Hester rode into town twice that week, once for salt and once for a sack of oats that Ember was going through faster than her August estimate had projected. Both times she noted the smoke pouring from every chimney in Ridge Hollow at a rate that told her more than any conversation would have. The town was burning through its winter reserves in November. December would be leaner. January would test what December had left. She did not say this to anyone. She recorded it in her own notebook. The new one she had started at the beginning of October, the pages of which held her measurements rather than Josiah's, though the small, careful hand in both was almost indistinguishable at a glance. Micah walked out to the bluff on the second Saturday of December, carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth that turned out to be a pair of boots his mother had repaired for him, and a smaller pair she had not yet had a chance to send. His younger sister had outgrown them. He asked without preamble whether Hester needed anything from the general store on his walk back. His breath fogged in the outer chamber, even at the higher air temperature the cave sustained against the day. She looked at him, standing there with the boots under one arm, and understood something she had not previously formulated in words. The boy was choosing to spend his Saturdays here, not because his mother required it, not because he owed her anything, but because the bluff had become the place his mind woke up in. A widow's laundry occupied his weekday hours with the specific dullness of chores paid for by the piece. The cave asked a different kind of attention from him, and he had become, without announcement, addicted to being asked. There's a folded list on the table inside. She kept her voice level the way she kept her voice level about everything she did not wish to comment on. Get what you can carry. Bring the change back on Monday if you have school. If you don't, tomorrow's fine. He nodded. He set the boots down carefully on the outer chamber floor, disappeared into the cabin, for the list came back with it folded in a pocket. He looked at the barometer mounted on its cedar bracket for a moment before he left, which he had learned to do the way apprentices learn to check their master's habits without being told. The needle sat higher than it had on his last visit, which meant nothing in particular except that the atmosphere had not yet decided anything new. Miss Halloway asked after you in class yesterday. He offered this to the doorframe rather than to her directly. Not by name. She asked if any of us knew whether the cave woman was going to attend the Christmas service. She said it like she wanted somebody to answer, but nobody did. Hester turned the plane she had been running along an off-cut plank and set it down on its side so the blade would not dull against the wood. What did you think she wanted the answer to be? I don't know. She had a face on. A face on how? He considered the question with the small, serious frown he brought to any question that asked him to describe a person accurately. Like she'd already picked which face to have, but she hadn't picked which words to put in front of it. My mother does the same thing when she's about to say something she'll take back later. She looked at him for a longer moment than she had intended. He was 15 years and 8 months old by the strict calendar count she kept absent-mindedly on his behalf. His observations about adult women were not the observations most 15-year-old boys were capable of forming, which meant either his mother had trained him to watch her, or grief had done it, or both. She did not ask. Tell Miss Halloway, if she asks again, that I attend to my own devotions in a warm room. That should end the conversation. He almost smiled. He caught it before it finished forming. He nodded once, picked up the boots, and left. The Christmas service came and went. She did not attend. What she did instead on Christmas morning was sit at her table with a mug of coffee that had been ground from beans she had traded a rancher for, and she opened Josiah's notebook to a page toward the back. A page she had not opened in months, because opening it required more of her than most mornings could afford. It was a page where he had written in December of '79 a small paragraph that had nothing to do with limestone, nothing to do with the railway, nothing to do with any professional obligation whatsoever. It read, "If we live long enough to build the thing I've been describing, I want the door to face the sunrise on the shortest day of the year. Not because it will change how the house works, but because it will change how the mornings feel. H will care about that even if she pretends not to." She had built the door facing south, which was the correct engineering decision, and the sunrise on the shortest day of the year did not reach her doorway. It reached the outer chamber only obliquely, a diffused glow filtered through the 12-meter mouth. She sat with the coffee and read the paragraph 3 times. Then she closed the book, put on her heavier coat, and walked to the cave entrance to watch the sunrise happen along a horizon that had nothing to do with her home. The morning was clear. The sun came up amber over the flat land. She stood there until her fingers ached inside her gloves. Then she went back inside and added a log to the stove. January arrived and the weather softened for 11 days, an ordinary January thaw that pulled the wind south and put the temperature above freezing for 4 consecutive afternoons. The people of Ridge Hollow used those 11 days the way prairie people always used a January thaw. They hauled wood they had not been able to reach in December. They dug out the wagon that had been buried at the north edge of Thresh's operation since the second week of the month. They walked to each other's houses without fully bundling. They lied to themselves about the winter being past its worst. Hester used the 11 days to reinforce the goat pen and to shore up 2 spots along the outer chamber where drifting snow had piled higher than she had budgeted for. She did not lie to herself about the winter. She had read the barometer at intervals across December, and what she had seen when she plotted the readings against the notebook Josiah had kept during his own years of taking readings across the prairie was a pattern that resembled a specific set of winters he had marked with a particular pencil notation. She had not decided yet what to do with that observation. She was watching. Farrell rode out to the bluff on the 8th of January. He had not been back since the previous summer, and his arrival at the outer chamber without invitation, without any apparent errand, marked itself in her attention as a thing worth noticing. He dismounted, tied his horse to the ring she had set in the rock face for that purpose, walked to where she was rehanging a shed door that the wind had knocked loose from one hinge. He stood watching her work for perhaps 30 seconds before he spoke. "I've been thinking about your flue arrangement." She did not stop working. "Have you?" "I've had a chimney fire at the Wickham house up on the Ridge Road. 3rd one this winter. I built that chimney myself. I know what I did right. The problem is not the chimney. The problem is what the winter is doing to the wood I'm feeding it." She set the hinge pin. She tested the swing of the door. She adjusted a shim with the small square hammer she kept in her belt for exactly that operation. "Green wood. People are burning what they haven't seasoned because they've run through the seasoned stock." "That's my read." "Then your read is correct." I was silent for a moment. She had not yet turned to look at him, which was not a discourtesy so much as a matter of the door demanding 2 hands. When she did turn, she found him standing with his hat off, which was a posture she had not seen him occupy in any prior interaction. "I came out to ask you a question, Mrs. Ainsworth. It's a question I've been carrying since October, and I've decided the carrying has cost enough. The flue arrangement you built. The natural fissure. If you were to explain the draw principle to me in language a builder would use, would you be willing to do that? I'm not asking as a courtesy. I'm asking because I'd like to try something at the Wickham house before the next hard freeze. She looked at him. It was not the same look she had given him in July. It was the look of a woman assessing whether a man's request was the surface of a request or the whole request. She decided after a moment that it was the whole request. Come inside, I'll make coffee. Bring your notebook. He brought his notebook. She made coffee. She spent the next hour and 40 minutes explaining in the language a builder would use the specific principles by which a natural fissure of the dimensions above her cabin produced a draft that exceeded a masonry chimney of equivalent height. He wrote fast. He asked questions that were focused technical without the concealed condescension that his July questions had carried. When he left, he shook her hand at the outer chamber entrance, which was a gesture he had not offered any woman in her presence before, and he did not make a small performance of the gesture. He simply shook her hand and mounted his horse and rode back toward Ridge Hollow with his notebook in his coat. She stood at the entrance and watched him go. Micah, who had arrived while Pharaoh was inside and had waited in the outer chamber without interrupting, came up beside her. What did he want? He wanted to know how the flue works. He also listened. Micah watched the horse disappear at the bend where the north track dropped toward the flatland. That's different. It is. She did not add anything to it. What she thought and what she did not say aloud was that Pharaoh had come to her because Pharaoh was the kind of man who could revise his model when the evidence became embarrassing. Thresh could not. Thresh's model was welded to his self-regard, and no evidence would separate the two. She did not know yet on the 8th of January what evidence the winter would produce, but she had begun to understand that the winter would produce it. The thaw ended on the 12th. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in a night. The 4 afternoons of standing water froze into sheets of ice that made every road in the county treacherous by dawn. A boy from a homestead 6 miles east of town, walking to check on a neighbor's chickens because his mother had asked him to slip on the porch step at his own house on the way back, and broke his wrist so badly that the doctor in town had to set it twice. The break did not heal correctly. High would carry the crookedness in that wrist into his old age. He did not yet know this. Nobody in Ridge Hollow did. It was one of a small handful of injuries the county absorbed that week without much comment. Hester read the barometer twice a day at first light and at dusk. She began recording the readings on a chart she had drawn on the inside cover of her own notebook, plotting them against the wind direction. The pattern that emerged over the last week of January and into the first days of February was not a pattern that resolved into anything she could name yet. It was a pattern that resembled the pre-storm signatures Josiah had recorded 3 times in his working years, twice of which had been followed by weather he had underlined with the small pencil asterisk that meant pay attention to this. On the 2nd of February, she wrote a note to herself in the margin of her chart. If this pattern continues 4 more days, I will ride into town and speak to the mayor. She did not want to speak to the mayor. She wanted the pattern to break. The pattern did not break. On the 5th of February, the barometer began falling in the specific accelerated way she had been watching for. She wrote in the margin, falling 3 days ahead of arrival. Not a system passing through, a system building toward. On the 6th, she saddled Ember dressed in her heaviest coat and rode into Ridge Hollow at first light. She went to the lumber yard first. Pharaoh was planning a door frame, moving the plane with the steady rhythm of a man for whom repetitive skilled work was a form of thinking. He looked up when she came in, and his expression sharpened when he saw her face because he had learned in January to read her face, as though it might contain information. Something's wrong. The barometer has been falling for 6 days. Not a normal system. The pressure signature matches a pattern my husband recorded in his working years. He marked those years with a specific notation. The last winter he applied it was 79. Lives were lost across the Central Plains between January and March of 80. He set the plane down. He did not sit. He did not do anything that would have signaled a comfortable receptivity to a warning. He simply held his position and waited for her to complete the report. The atmospheric signature has been building for 3 days. I estimate the arrival within 72 hours. When it arrives, it will not be a 2-day blow. It will be longer. It will be colder. The wind will come from the northwest at speeds no frame structure in this county was designed to accommodate. You need to check your roof cross members this week. You need to bank fires deep before you sleep. You need to make sure every family within a mile of the town square Has more water inside than they think they need because the pumps will freeze in the first hour. Pharaoh was silent for a stretch that was longer than politeness and shorter than dismissal. What he said when he spoke surprised her. I'll check the cross members this afternoon. The Wickham house I'm reinforcing anyway. I'll get the word to the 4 families I've built for in the last 3 years. Beyond that, ma'am, I don't have standing to tell people what to do. You know that. I know that. You should tell the mayor. He'll not act on it, but you should tell him. That was my next stop. He looked at her for another moment. The pattern your husband recorded. He wrote what happens in a country like this when it holds. He wrote that the country stops being what people thought it was. He wrote it in 79 before he had seen it prove out in 80. He was not a man who exaggerated. Pharaoh nodded once and picked the plane back up, though he did not resume planing. She left the lumberyard with the specific unease of a person who has been believed by exactly one man and now must go tell the same story to 5 who will not. The general store was warm. Mrs. Hollis stood behind her counter with a small kettle steaming and a set of accounts open in front of her. Hester delivered her warning in the same words she had used for Pharaoh, adjusted for the audience, only insofar as she made her sentences shorter. Mrs. Hollis wrote it on the back of a receipt with the pencil stub she kept behind her ear, thanked her for the concern, and immediately began discussing with the woman beside her whether the Ainsworth widow's cave living had produced ideas about weather that were more poetic than reliable. At the livery, the stableman nodded through her whole account with the thorough attentiveness of a person who had already decided not to act. He asked no questions. He offered no follow-up. He said only that he would keep an ear on the horses, which was what he always said. Mayor Redmond received her in his office with a cup of coffee he did not share. He listened. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them, which was the gesture she remembered from the previous July, and which she now understood was not merely his tell for arranging his expression, but the specific mechanism by which he prepared himself to refuse a woman's counsel without appearing to refuse it. We take all concerns seriously, Mrs. Ainsworth. She recognized the sentence. She did not have the patience to answer it. You'll be shy at least 4 coffins by the end of next week if you do not send word tonight to the outlying homesteads. Some of them will not hear the warning even if you send it. Some will. The ones who hear it will remember who told them, and they will remember who did not. Redmond's spectacles paused mid-clean. It was the closest thing to a reaction she had produced in him in 8 months. He set the spectacles down. He looked at her for a long moment. What he said then was more honest than she had expected. I don't know how to send that warning without being laughed at, ma'am. The town will not hear it from me if I hear it from you. Then send it from Pharaoh. He'll co-sign. He'll tell you the same reading of the barometer I told him this morning. Something in his face changed slightly. He did not commit to the action. He did not refuse. He replaced the spectacles on his nose and told her he would consider what she had said. That was the best she was going to get from him, and she did not waste breath asking for better. Thresh she did not seek out. Thresh had not modified a single position since the July morning she had filed on the parcel, and she did not believe a barometric reading was going to be the thing that changed him. She was reasonably confident going to lose animals in the coming week, regardless of what she said to him, and she had used her limited moral credit with the mayor on people whose ears were less firmly welded shut. She found Micah at the edge of the schoolyard between morning and afternoon sessions. He was standing alone eating a piece of hard biscuit from a cloth his mother had wrapped it in. When he saw her, he swallowed what was in his mouth and came to meet her at the fence line. You look like you rode fast. I did. Listen carefully. There is a storm coming within 3 days. I do not know how bad. Bad enough that I've been to Pharaoh Hollis, the stableman, and the mayor. Pharaoh believes me. The others have written it on receipts they will not read again. I need you to hear this without asking me to soften it. He straightened his shoulders in the way she had seen him straighten them when she asked him to hold an end of the surveyor's chain against a wind. I'm listening. If your mother permits you to come to the cave when the sky begins to change, come. If she does not permit, you do not argue with her. You go to the livery. The livery is the sturdiest frame building in Ridge Hollow. Pharaoh reinforced the cross members 2 years ago. The walls are thick. There is stove wood inside. There will be other people. If you cannot reach the livery, you go to the grain warehouse behind Hollis's store. There is stove wood there also, and packing material you can burn if you have to. Do not try to move once the storm has arrived. Do you understand me? Yes. Not for any reason, not to help a neighbor, not to check on your mother if she is already sheltered, not for a horse. The visibility will be zero within minutes of the wind reaching full strength. People who move in that kind of weather die within 30 minutes of the last decision they make. He nodded. She could see him filing every part of what she had said into the part of his mind that ran automatically the operational layer. The layer she had spent 7 months teaching him to load with practical information. The way other people loaded their pockets with matches. I'll ask my mother tonight. Ask her tonight. If she says no, go to the livery on the first sign of change. If the sign comes at school hours, tell Miss Halloway. She will not know what to do with the information, but she will remember you told her, and that will matter later. He looked at her for a long moment. What he said then landed differently than either of them had expected. Mrs. Ainsworth, if it is as bad as you're telling me, then people are going to die who didn't listen. You know that. I know that. How do you carry that you told them? They didn't hear. She held his eyes. She did not soften what she said. You carry it by having told them once correctly in the words the situation deserved. You do not carry it by telling them again in words designed to be more persuasive. The distance between what a person needs to hear and what a person will hear is not a distance any single warning can cross. You will learn this. I am sorry that you will learn it this week. I was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded one time and went back to his biscuit, though he did not eat any more of it before the bell rang. She rode back to the bluff in the fading afternoon light. The sky to the northwest had begun to take on the color she had seen once before in her life. In the winter of '80 riding survey lines with Josiah, in the weeks before the tunnel work that had ended him. It was a yellow-gray, the color of old bruising, a color that had no natural place in the Dakota winter palette. It sat on the horizon like a stain that would not lift. She spent the 7th of February preparing the cave for a number of occupants she could not yet estimate. She moved the remaining hay and grain from the outer chamber into the stalls so that no journey through weather would be required to feed the animals. She filled every available vessel with water. The 2 buckets by the stove, the tin wash basin, a wooden cask that held 8 gallons, the cast iron pot that was too heavy to lift without a strap she rigged from an old harness. She inspected every seal on the cabin windows, running her fingers along each frame where she had packed wool tow into the gaps in September, pressing in additional material wherever she found compression. The door was solid oak, 7.5 centimeters thick, hung on iron hinges she had set into the rock face with lead-caulked bolt holes. She opened it. She closed it. She tested the bar. The stove received a full load of hardwood banked to burn slowly through the night. She checked the flue draw with a lit candle held near the firebox. The flame pulled clean toward the pipe with the strong, steady draft the natural fissure had provided since October. The barometric low outside was actively increasing the draw by creating a pressure differential that wanted to move interior air upward at a rate slightly higher than a settled atmosphere would have permitted. This was, she noted with the small, dry satisfaction of a woman confirming a calculation exactly what Josiah had predicted in a footnote she had underlined in her own hand the previous January. She sat down at the table with both notebooks open in front of her. She wrote the date in the barometric reading and her estimate of the storm's arrival window. She wrote in the margin of her own book, "If I am wrong, I will have bought extra flour and frightened no one who deserved to be unfrightened. If I am right, everything that follows will depend on what has already been built." Then she closed both notebooks, placed them on the shelf where they lived, and waited. Micah appeared at the cave entrance at 10 o'clock on the morning of the 8th of February with a canvas satchel over his shoulder and his younger sister's outgrown boots tied by the laces around his neck. His mother, he explained, had listened to him at dinner the night before with the specific attentive silence, a widow reserved for the possibility that her only son had begun making adult decisions. She had asked him 3 questions. What had Mrs. Ainsworth's reasoning been? What had he thought of her reasoning? What did he intend to do if the storm came while he was in the schoolhouse? He had answered each question as directly as he could. She had said at the end of it that he should go to the bluff at the first sign of the sky changing, that he should bring his sister's boots because they might fit one of the younger children who ended up sheltering there, that he should tell Mrs. Ainsworth that she, the mother, would keep the laundry stove burning and the door barred, and that she was not to be worried about. Hester received this account without commenting on any of it directly. She took the boots. She hung them from a peg by the door. She showed Micah where she had positioned the water vessels, the additional wool blankets she had pulled from the cedar chest, the extra sacks of cornmeal and beans and salt pork she had purchased at Hollis's the previous week, under a set of glances that had suggested Mrs. Hollis was reconsidering whether the widow's warning had been more than poetic. "Your mother is not a fool." "No, ma'am. You should tell her so when this is over." He looked at the floor. "I've never told her that in words. She'd know something was wrong." "Then tell her something else that's true. Whatever you can say without making her think you've been struck in the head." He almost laughed. He didn't. He picked up the small hatchet she had left leaning against the doorframe and asked what she wanted him to do first. They worked through the morning. He split the last of the kindling into pieces smaller than she would ordinarily have bothered with, because small pieces caught faster in a hurry. He checked the ropes on the cow's stall gate, which she had already checked, but which she permitted him to check again, because a boy expecting weather did better with a task than without one. He brought the hay bale bench she had built in the outer chamber the previous September inside the cabin, positioning it along the north wall where anyone sitting on it would benefit from both the radiant heat of the stove and the sheltered geometry of the rock above. By mid-afternoon on the 8th, the sky over Ridge Hollow had gone, the particular flat that meant the atmosphere had made its decision and was waiting only on the mechanical business of executing it. Hester stood at the cave entrance for 20 minutes with her coat on, reading the air. The birds were gone. Not migrated gone in the ordinary way of birds moving south. Gone in the specific way birds went when the atmospheric pressure crossed a threshold, their biology recognized ahead of human instrument. The creek bottom to the east was silent. The prairie to the south stretched flat and mute in every direction. The air carried a density that was not cold exactly. It was heavier than cold, charged with the quality a room had before a conversation that was going to change everything in it. She turned and went back inside. She checked the barometer one final time. She noted the reading. She looked at Micah, who was standing at the stove with the small square of cloth his mother used to wrap his lunch folded neatly in his hand, waiting for the instruction he could sense was coming. "It will arrive by tomorrow afternoon, possibly overnight. There is nothing more we can do inside. I want you to go check the outer chamber one last time. Then I want you to eat what your mother packed you and sleep for as long as you can, because after it starts, sleep will be a thing we ration." He nodded. He went. She stood at the entrance again for a long moment after he had passed her, watching the horizon to the northwest, where the yellow-gray had spread from a stain to a wall. It sat there without moving the way a large animal sat before it charged. She thought, without deciding to think it, that her whole life for the last 27 months had been organized around this specific stretch of hours. Not around the storm, which she could not have predicted in '79, but around the possibility of demonstrating a principle Josiah had died believing in without proof. The storm was the mechanism. The demonstration was the point. She did not want the demonstration. She wanted her husband back. Since she could not have him back, she wanted the record corrected. Since she could not correct the record on her own authority, she needed the weather to do it. The weather had arrived at her door. She stepped back into the cabin and closed the oak. Night on the 8th passed with a stillness that was itself a warning. Ember shifted twice in his stall. The goats did not settle at all. The cow lay down and got up 3 times in the space of an hour, which was her mechanism for expressing an unease she did not have any other way to communicate. Micah slept on the hay bale bench under 2 of the wool blankets, curled the way boys curled when they were young enough to remember being small and old enough to be embarrassed by the memory. Hester did not sleep. She sat at the table with a candle burning low and read Josiah's notebook straight through from the first page to the last for what she suspected might be the final full reading she would give it in one sitting. She wanted, before what was coming came, to have him fully in her mind. She wanted the storm, when it arrived, to arrive at a woman whose husband was still recently and completely present in her thoughts. She finished the notebook at 4 in the morning. She closed it. She sat with her hands flat on the cover for a long time. She did not weep. She had done her weeping in the first winter after his death, in the specific quantities the situation had permitted, and the well was not empty, but it was not open on this particular night. What she felt instead was a quiet ferocity that had no target, yet no shape, only a direction. She looked at Micah sleeping on the bench. She thought about the 400 people in Ridge Hollow. She thought about Thresh, whom she had not warned, and she felt no regret about that, because Thresh would not have hurt her, and she had not had the warnings to spare. She thought about the boy with the crooked wrist from the January thaw, whom she did not know and would not meet. And she thought that the county was full of people whose small wounds she would never learn about, and that this was the ordinary condition of living in a place large enough to hurt people out of sight of one another. She thought then of the specific sentence Josiah had written on the last page of the notebook, a sentence he had underlined once and dated, "The country will punish us for what we have not built correctly. The only defense is to build one correct thing." She had built one correct thing. At 17 minutes past 3 in the afternoon on the 9th of February, the correct thing was tested. The wind did not build, it appeared. One moment the prairie held its final composed silence, the specific silence of a country waiting for something it had already agreed to receive. The next moment the silence had been replaced by a single continuous sound that seemed to have always been there, fully formed, as though the preceding hours had been a clerical error. The atmosphere was now correcting. Hester was standing at the cabin door with a stove log in her right hand when the change arrived. She felt it before she heard it. The pressure inside her ears adjusted downward, then downward, again the way it did on a fast descent through a canyon. She set the log carefully on the floor. She walked to the outer chamber. She looked at what the world had become. She could not see 3 meters. The snow was not falling. It had ceased to be snow in any recognizable sense. It was the medium. The air had become a white substance that had replaced air as the material of the world outside the bluff. The wind pitched at a frequency she had never heard from any weather in her life, a high metallic note that ran through the limestone as much as through her bones, so that she felt the storm through the soles of her boots at the same rate she heard it through her ears. The temperature on the exposed skin of her face was not sensation. It was damage in progress, delivered in the specific accelerated way, a burn delivered damage before the nerves had time to translate. She stepped back 1 meter. The wind died to nothing. The limestone overhang above the cave entrance was performing exactly the function she had built the cabin, to depend on diverting the gale over and past the mouth, leaving the entrance chamber in a pocket of relative stillness, inside a country that had otherwise ceased to be habitable. The temperature in the outer chamber was perhaps 8 below zero, cold enough to require gloves, survivable indefinitely for a person with the sense to keep moving. She stood at the boundary between the pocket and the storm for 30 seconds, memorizing the specific quality of the sound. She would need the memory later when the storm ended and someone asked her to describe what it had been. She went back inside. Micah was awake. He had come off the hay bale bench at the first change in pressure without her prompting, which meant either his ears had adjusted the way hers had, or the animals had told him. He was standing by the stove with the small canvas satchel his mother had packed him already slung across his chest, the way a boy prepared for a school he might not return from. How bad? Worse than I estimated. I underestimated the wind speed. The temperature has probably dropped another 12 degrees since we last read the thermometer. The visibility is 0. If anyone attempts to reach us in the first hour, they will not arrive. He did not respond to this. He had learned in the last 24 hours that responding to her weather statements with anything other than acknowledgement wasted her breath. He walked to the door of the cabin, tested the bar, checked the seal at the base where she had packed additional wool the previous afternoon. He came back to the stove and added a single piece of oak, which was exactly what she would have added at exactly the rate she had planned to add. She noted without comment that he had learned her method. The first 8 hours of the storm passed with the specific inward density of hours a person spent listening for something they could not do anything about. She made coffee. She made a small pot of oats. She fed the animals in their stalls, which required only stepping into the outer chamber, which was still holding at -8, which meant Ember and the cow and the goats were slightly cold, but nowhere near any threshold that required intervention. The cow's milk had come in that morning at approximately half her usual quantity, which Hester had expected. Cows produce less in extremity. She would produce more when the extremity ended. At the 6th hour, Hester walked to the entrance again to check whether the storm's character had changed. It had not. The wall of white was still perfectly present, the wind still at the pitch. It had begun at the temperature at whatever number lay beneath the point at which her thermometer had frozen its indicator in place. She looked toward the direction of Ridge Hollow and could not see the near edge of the bluff's outer face, which was less than 8 meters from where she stood. She thought, without wanting to think it, about the people she had warned who had not listened. She thought about the people she had not warned because she could not have reached them. She thought about Thresh's operation in the valley to the south, where a barn built on flat ground with a broad north-facing wall was at this hour absorbing whatever the storm had decided a broad north-facing wall deserved. At the 9th hour, she heard the sound she had been dreading and had known she would hear. It came muffled through 6 meters of limestone, faint under the shriek of the wind, but distinct in its own signature. A long structural groan from the direction of the valley sustained for perhaps 4 seconds, followed by a specific final crack. Then nothing. She knew what nothing meant in that context. A roof under 6 meters of accumulated snow, with wind adding lateral pressure against a broad wall, the roof had not been designed to reinforce against, could do only one thing. She hoped the men were in the main house. She did not yet know whether that hope was warranted. She did not tell Micah what she had heard. The second day held. The third day held. On the third afternoon, she began to notice a change in the light that filtered through the outer chamber. The white had shifted from the pure aggressive white of the first hours to a slightly grayer white, which meant the storm was redistributing rather than weakening, which meant the wind was reworking the snow that had already fallen, rather than adding new snow at the same rate. This was not good news. It meant the drifts were forming their final architecture. The sculptural drifts, the ones that would bury houses to their eaves, the ones that would erase the road she had ridden into town on for 7 months, were being assembled at this hour on the exterior side of the bluff. And Hester knew from her father's Ohio winters, and from Josiah's prairie ones, that the drifts would outlast the storm by weeks. She used the change in light to take a full inventory of her supplies, which was less about necessity than about the discipline of knowing exactly where she stood. She had food for 6 weeks for herself alone, for 20 people perhaps 10 days, for 37. She did not know yet how many people would come. She did not know if anyone would come, but she had built the cabin with the generosity of a mind that planned for what a situation would actually require, rather than what was comfortable to anticipate, and she had bought supplies at the November rate, rather than the December rate specifically because she had wanted the margin. Micah slept the third night on the bench with one of the wool blankets pulled fully over his head in the way of a boy who had decided that whatever the storm produced next would not be improved by his witnessing it in real time. She let him sleep. She sat by the stove with her own notebook open and made a list in numbered order of the tasks she would need to accomplish in the first 60 minutes after the storm broke. Rescue operations required sequence. Sequence required pre-planning. She wrote until the candle burned low. They came to her on the fourth day. She heard them before she saw them. A sound that was wrong against the storm's consistency. A human irregularity in the mechanical noise of the wind. She went to the outer chamber with a lamp and held it up, knowing the light would not carry far, but might carry far enough to signal the direction of the entrance to a person already inside the 20-meter margin where visibility began to permit shapes. 2 figures materialized from the white. They were barely recognizable as humans, so encased in ice and packed snow that their outlines had softened into something more geological than biological. They moved with the specific gait of people who had been reduced to a single objective that required every remaining resource, people for whom momentum was all that was left of decision-making. People who would not stop even if she called out, because stopping meant reassessing, and reassessing was no longer within their capacity. Wendell Farrow fell into the outer chamber first. His son, 17 years old, built like his father, hit the rock floor 2 steps behind him on both knees and did not immediately try to stand. Farrow remained upright, but the uprightness had cost him visibly. His face was a ruin of cold patches of white on both cheeks and across the bridge of the nose that indicated frostbite well past the surface. His hands, when Hester caught his arm to steady him, were rigid as fence rails. "I made it, God, I made it, my wife, my daughter." She did not answer the fragment. She was already moving, unwrapping the ice from his outer coat with the specific efficiency she brought to all physical problems. No waste, no commentary, only the sequence of actions required in the order they were required. She got him into the cabin. She got the son into the cabin. She sat both of them by the stove. She wrapped them in the wool blankets from the cedar chest. She put water on to heat. She sent Micah, who had come off the bench the moment the arrival began, to close the outer chamber door partway, so the pocket of relative stillness at the entrance would hold more warmth without cutting off the animal's air supply. Farrow drank the broth she handed him with both hands, because a single hand would not grip yet. His son drank in silence with the specific vacant attention of a boy who had used up his responses. Farrow spoke first without being asked. "The chimney backed up on the third night. Greenwood. I knew it would. I fed it anyway because there was nothing else. The smoke drove us into the back room. We wet cloths over our faces. By this morning, the temperature in the room was below 0. My wife could not walk. My daughter could walk, but only with support. I made the decision to leave them in the back room with every blanket in the house. I told them to seal the door and wait. My boy and I attempted the bluff. We found the fence line. Hester waited. She had built the fence line the previous September, running the North Road perimeter with a set of posts spaced at 15 meters, which the town had considered unnecessary because the road was rough terrain that regular traffic did not use. She had built it anyway because a fence line in visible weather was the difference between arrival and death in invisible weather. She had not said this at the time. She did not say it now. Pharaoh closed his eyes. I owe you 2 lives, ma'am. My boys and mine. My wife and daughter, if they hold until this ends, that will be 3 more. I've got 30 years of building houses. I set mine wrong. I framed it on flat ground with the wide side facing the wrong direction, because the wide side facing that direction gave the parlor the best afternoon light. I decided a parlor's afternoon light against a Dakota winter. That's the trade I made. That's what my 30 years bought me. She let the sentence sit in the room. She did not try to soften it. Pharaoh needed to say it out loud in the exact words he had chosen in the presence of a witness who understood what the trade had cost. That was a debt she could accept his paying. Anything less would have insulted him. Rest now. When the storm breaks, we go back for them together. I have the equipment. I have the horse. I have the routes. Your part of the work is to survive the next 4 days so you can walk beside me. Pharaoh nodded. His son had already fallen asleep sitting up against the wall, which was permitted because sleep in a warm room was the fastest available restorative for a body that had been forcing itself forward for 6 hours through weather that should have killed it in one. Mayor Redmond came on the afternoon of the 5th day. He arrived alone. The left side of his face had blackened past the point where any topical treatment could restore the tissue, which meant he would carry the scar of this arrival for whatever remained of his life. He came into the outer chamber under his own power. He stopped inside the door of the cabin without waiting to be invited. He looked at the 23 degrees of interior temperature the stove was maintaining, and at Pharaoh sleeping by the wall, and at the boy on the bench, and at Hester standing by the table. He said the sentence he had been rehearsing for the last 4 hours of walking through weather that had reduced his rehearsal to essentials. The north span of my house collapsed at 3 in the morning. I got out through the south window. I lost the office papers, the town records, and the last 12 years of correspondence. Mrs. Ainsworth, if this town has a next spring, I will owe you the writing of every record that survives, because you told me on the 6th of February, and I did not act. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about telling him that the town would have a next spring, regardless of whether he owed her anything. She thought about telling him that the office papers could be reconstructed, that the correspondence had already served its purpose, that the record of who had said what to whom in February would be written by the people who lived through it, not by any surviving document. She said none of these things. What she said was practical. Sit down. Take off your outer coat. There is broth in the pot. There is a bench by the wall. If you can hold water, drink water first. Broth second. He obeyed her without hesitation. Something in the way he obeyed her told her that a corner had turned in the county's understanding of who she was, and that the turning would outlast the storm, regardless of what happened next. Prudence Holloway arrived an hour after Redmond, leading 3 children by hand. 2 girls, 1 boy, all approximately 9 years old. All of them past the capacity for ordinary fear and into the quieter territory beyond it. She had been in the schoolhouse when the storm began. The 3 children were the ones whose parents lived on the north edge of town, too far to safely retrieve. She had made the decision to stay rather than attempt the walk with 3 children in her charge. They had survived 4 days on melted snow, a tin of hard biscuits she had kept in her desk drawer, and the schoolhouse's single stove, which had run out of coal on the 3rd day. She had burned the 3 back row benches on the 4th day. She had burned the map cabinet on the 5th. She had left the schoolhouse when the sound of the wind on the roof told her the roof was not going to hold another night. The children came into the cabin first. They found the wall of blankets by the stove and folded themselves into it with the specific quiet cooperation of children whose fear had exceeded their vocabulary. Holloway came in behind them with her hands pressed flat against her thighs, which Hester understood immediately was the posture of a woman holding herself together through pure structural commitment. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the temperature. She looked at the children settling into the blankets. She looked at Hester. I was wrong about what you were capable of. I said it in a public place. I said it to a woman who repeated it. I do not have language yet for the size of what I was wrong about. Hester turned back to the pot she was warming. "Sit down, Miss Halloway. Get the children warm. Language will come later. It always does." Halloway sat. She did not sit gracefully. She sat with the specific unbending of a woman who had been standing on principle for 4 days and had permitted her body to accept the chair only because the alternative was falling into it. Hester handed her a mug of broth. Halloway drank. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried in the presence of witnesses. What she did instead was reach into the inner pocket of her coat and remove a small green leather notebook, which she set on the table beside Hester's own. "I've been keeping a record since the storm began. Observations from the schoolhouse, the temperature at each hour, what the children ate, what I burned, the last observation before I left. I did not do it for a reason yet. I did it because I did not know what else to do with my hands. When this ends, if you will permit it, I would like to add my notes to whatever record you keep of these days. Not for me, for the school. The children need to know what happened here in a form that will outlast the retelling." Hester looked at the small green notebook. She did not open it. She did not need to. What she said when she said it surprised Halloway in a way that showed on her face briefly before she recomposed it. "You will not add your notes to mine, Miss Halloway. You will begin your own record. You will teach from it. The principles that made this cabin possible do not belong to my notebook. They belong to the children in that schoolhouse. My husband died believing he could not put them in front of anyone. I have put them in front of one weather. You will put them in front of a generation." Halloway did not answer. She held the notebook against her chest for a moment. Then she set it back on the table closer to Hester's than she had first placed it, though not touching. It was the closest thing to an embrace either woman was going to permit, and both of them understood the arrangement. The others came through that afternoon and into the evening of the 6th day, in singles and in pairs and in small groups that had attached themselves to larger parties for the final crossing. A farmer from 2 miles north who had followed the creek bed by feel. A woman with 2 children who had been guided by her husband to the base of the bluff before he turned back for a neighbor who had not made it out. 2 of Thresh's cattle hands half carrying each other, arriving with an older man from the adjacent operation who had followed their line of travel by watching the wind pattern in the snow they left behind them. Each arrival came in from the white with the same expression, stripped of everything except the most necessary version of themselves. Hester took each one, unwrapped the coats, checked the extremities, positioned them by the stove or in the outer chamber, depending on their condition. She did not permit anyone to speak beyond the first exchange of information necessary to place them. Talking cost heat. Talking cost energy. Talking cost the specific composure the survivors had used up in the walking. By the end of the 6th day, 24 people occupied the cave, plus Hester and Micah, which brought the total to 26. The count that would eventually settle at 27 was still one arrival away. Thresh came alone on the evening of the 6th day. This was characteristic. Nothing in his life had prepared him to arrive at a woman's door in company. He came in from the outer chamber after dark, without the horse, without the silver-trimmed saddle, without any of the apparatus by which he ordinarily announced himself to a room. Hester was standing at the stove when she heard his boots on the rock floor of the outer chamber. She did not need to look up. She recognized the weight in the pace, which had not changed, even though nothing else about him had remained. He stopped inside the cabin door. He held his hat in both hands in front of him. She looked at him. She had not seen him remove his hat indoors in her presence, or she suspected in the presence of any other woman in the county. He had not shaved in a week. The right side of his beard was matted with ice that had melted and refrozen twice on the walk from the valley. The apparatus of the man who had ridden up to her cave the previous July on a silver-trimmed saddle to call the bluff a badger's territory was gone from him. What remained was a large body with a hat in its hands, standing in a room he had not been invited into, waiting for permission to speak. She gave him the permission by handing him a mug of broth. He took it in one hand. His hat stayed in the other. "2 of my men are dead, ma'am." The cabin, which had been full of the low sounds of 24 people breathing and eating and shifting on blankets, went quiet. In the specific way shared space went quiet when everyone in it had recognized that something private was about to become public, because there was no private place left available for it. Halloway did not look up from the child she was tending. Pharaoh, awake now, looked at the floor. The mayor's uninjured eye tracked Thresh with the particular focus of a man who understood that whatever was about to happen would be recorded in the county's memory, whether or not any pen wrote it down. They went back into the storm on the second day to move the cattle after the roof came down. I let them go. I told them the barn could still be saved. I believed it because I had bought the barn for $3,000, and I could not conceive of a Dakota winter that would defeat $3,000 of pegged oak. The barn was not defeated by the winter. The barn was defeated by my having built it in the wrong place with the wrong wall facing the wrong direction. I know that now because I walked past what remains of it this morning at first light. The remains do not require an engineer to interpret. A woman with a stove and a good notebook could have interpreted them from 400 miles away. He stopped. He was not stopping for effect. He was stopping because the next part was difficult, and he was a man who had not spent his life practicing difficult things. What I said about your work, I said in a specific voice in front of specific people so that other men would feel safe repeating it. That is what men in my position do. We give other men permission to say what they have already thought but have not yet said. I gave that permission 6 months ago. Every man who has said threshold in a public place since July has said it because I said it first. Their share of that word is small. My share is the whole of the word. I am not asking you to release me from any part of it. I am telling you that I know what I owe. 2 of my men are dead. There will be a count of animals when the storm ends. There will be a widow and however many children between them. I intend to make that count, and I intend to pay what I can pay. That is not restitution. There is no restitution available. It is only what a man does when he has been wrong in a way that has bodies attached. He stopped speaking. The cabin held the silence for a long moment. Hester looked at him. She looked at his hat in his hand. She looked at the ice in the beard. She looked at the mug of broth she had put in his other hand, which he had not yet drunk from because he had not permitted himself to drink from it until he had finished saying what he had come to say. She did not soften what she said. She did not decorate it. Sit down, Mr. Thresh. Drink the broth while it is warm. You did not come here to be forgiven. You came here because there was nowhere else to go, and because you have understood that the 2 facts are related. That is enough for tonight. He sat down. He drank. He did not speak again that night, and she did not require him to. The 27th occupant arrived the following morning on the 7th day of the storm, which was a Thursday, though nobody in the cabin had tracked the days by name for 4 of them. It was Micah's mother, Delphi Doverly. She had left the laundry at first light of the 7th day because the sound of the wind on her roof had changed in the night, the same change Halloway had recognized at the schoolhouse, the change that told a person the roof was not going to hold much longer. She had walked to the livery to find her son been told he had never arrived there, and understood in one breath what he had done and where he had gone. She had walked the fence line to the bluff. She had done it in 6 hours. Her face when Hester opened the outer chamber door to her was the specific face of a woman who had been walking toward the possibility that her only child was dead and had permitted herself to hope only in the last 100 meters. Micah crossed the room before Hester finished opening the door. He reached his mother in 3 steps. He did not say anything. Delphi did not either. She held him at arm's length for a moment to look at his face, then pulled him against her with the specific final grip of a mother confirming a fact by touch rather than by sight. She looked over his shoulder at Hester. Mrs. Ainsworth, my boy told me you told him to come here. My boy told me you would keep him alive. I did not know how to believe him. I know now. I am here because I could not stay in my house, and I did not want to arrive at your door and find him not here. Hester nodded once. She did not offer any of the softer sentences that would have been offered by another woman in another situation. She put a wool blanket into Delphi's hands and directed her to a spot near the stove that she had held open since the 4th day for exactly this arrival, though she had not permitted herself to name it that. She organized the cave the way a person organized any space with too many bodies in it and not enough of anything else. She partitioned the outer chamber with hung blankets to create a maintained temperature zone for the animals, so that the shared body heat of Ember and the cow and the goats would raise the ambient temperature in their partition by 3 degrees without any additional stove fuel. The cabin interior held the highest priority cases, the children, the frostbite injuries, Halloway, whose hands had developed blistering on the backs from cold exposure that would require days to heal. The outer chamber held the stable and mobile adults. She rationed the food by calculation. 387 person days of caloric supply divided among 27 people for an unknown duration with a conservative floor below which she would not go against an upper ceiling that permitted adequate function. Nobody went hungry. Nobody ate comfortably. This was the correct outcome. She did not sleep more than 3 hours together across those 7 days. She moved through the cave at intervals through each night, checking the stove, checking the outer chamber, checking the animals, checking the people. She developed over those days an exact acoustic knowledge of how each person in the cave sounded, which meant she could tell in the dark, which children woke at which hours, which adults needed a word from her, which adults needed only the assurance that she was awake and moving. Pharaoh rose twice on the 5th night to help her tend the stove without being asked. Redmond woke on the 6th morning offering to write out a supply inventory in the town's ledger hand, which she permitted him to do because the writing gave him a function, and functions restored men who had lost them. On the night of the 7th day, she rose at what she estimated was 2 in the morning. The cave was dark except for the stove's glow through the iron grate. She moved through the sleeping shapes in the outer chamber, with her lamp turned low, stepping over legs and around huddled backs. In the far corner, Holloway lay with her back against the limestone wall, and her coat pulled over her as a second blanket, and her hat over her face as a sleep mask. The positioning was absurd in the way of a woman who had retained her habits of propriety through conditions that had stripped everything else away. Hester stood for a moment in the near dark and looked at her. She thought about the general store the previous July. She thought about the sentence Holloway had spoken. She thought that Holloway was in most respects a careful and honest thinker who had applied careful and honest thinking to an incomplete data set and had arrived at the wrong answer. It was a mistake, Hester understood. She had made it about Josiah once in the early months of his limestone obsession, when she had thought his fixation on the tunnels was what grief did to a practical man, though the grief had been for his own father at the time, not for her since she had still been living. She had been wrong. She had been wrong, and then he had died, and she had read the notebook, and she had understood exactly how wrong she had been, which was an education no one would choose, but which everyone who received it was permanently changed by. She adjusted the coat over Holloway's shoulder where it had slipped. She walked back to the stove. She opened the firebox. She fed in one piece of oak. She sat down in her chair. She waited for morning. Outside, the storm held. It held through 3 more hours of darkness, held through the first gray light, held through the full cold brightness of the February morning. Then at approximately 9 o'clock on the morning of the 16th of February, on the 8th day, the sound changed. The pitch dropped. The shrieking lost its top register, then its middle. It fell to a moan, then a whistle, then a low continuous pressure that was wind but was no longer weapon. In the span of 20 minutes, the storm gave back the world. The sudden silence was louder than the storm had been. Hester stood at the outer chamber entrance and looked out at a Dakota territory she did not recognize. The snow had been sculpted by 7 days of 100-kilometer wind into forms that had no agricultural reference, no frontier vocabulary, no useful name in any language she knew. Great curving walls 6 meters high, scoured channels bare to the earth, drifts that had buried the tree line entirely and left only abstract white shapes where familiar landmarks had been. Ridge Hollow was invisible. The main street, the church steeple, the lumber yard, all of it lay beneath a featureless white plain that gave no indication anything had ever stood on it. Behind her, 26 other people were beginning to stir. She could hear the specific quality of the waking, the first few sounds, then more, then the gradual reconstruction of voices from sleep. Children first, then adults, then the movement of people, remembering where they were, what had brought them, what it meant that the sound outside had stopped. She stood at the entrance a moment longer looking at the altered world. She turned back inside. She organized them before the last of the sleepers had fully woken. This was not impatience. It was the recognition that the first hour after a crisis ended was the most dangerous hour, the one in which relief loosened the discipline that had kept people alive, the one in which the impulse to simply stop overrode the judgment that stopping was not yet safe. She woke Pharaoh first because he was the most physically capable adult in the space after herself, because he knew construction, because she needed someone who could look at a damaged structure and tell her in minutes what needed to happen to it. She woke Thresh second because whatever he was now humbled, quieted, stripped of the performance of himself, he still commanded the largest labor force in the county, assuming those men were alive, assuming they had sheltered somewhere survivable. She gave the cave's interior management to Holloway without discussion, which was the right assignment for reasons that had nothing to do with forgiveness or its absence. Holloway was precise, organized, capable of maintaining order among frightened people through the specific authority of a woman accustomed to managing rooms that did not want to be managed. She gave her the supply inventory, the rationing schedule, the list of who needed the most monitoring. Holloway took the papers. She read them. She looked up with an expression that had shed everything performative. She nodded once. The transaction was complete. Hester pulled on her outermost coat, the one with the extra wool lining she had sewn in September. She pulled her hat down to her eyebrows. She wrapped her muffler twice around her face. She checked her gloves. She looked at Delphi Doverly, who had risen to say something and had chosen at the last moment not to say it, and she gave the woman the small acknowledgement a nod could carry across a room too full to cross on foot. She stepped out into what the storm had left behind. The cold was the first shock. Not the wind-driven assault of the past 8 days, but the still profound cold of a clear Dakota sky after a blizzard, the kind that had no movement to it, no distraction from its own temperature. The thermometer she had mounted at the cave entrance read 31 below. The sky was the specific blue of extreme cold, a color too saturated to look natural, as though the storm had scoured the atmosphere down to a purity ordinary weather never produced. The world was unrecognizable in the way that mattered most, not aesthetically altered, but functionally erased. The landmarks by which a person navigated this landscape, the fence lines, the creek margins, the road cuts, the tree breaks that marked property boundaries, all of it had been redistributed. The snow had not fallen in layers that preserved the terrain shape. It had been moved, sorted, stacked, and sculpted by a week of directional wind into a geography that bore no relationship to the one beneath it. Where she knew a slight depression in the ground marked the North Road, there was now a ridge 4 meters high. Where she knew a stand of cottonwoods had grown along the creek, there was a flat white plain. She stood at the bluff's base for a moment, reading the new landscape with the surveyor's habit Josiah had given her, looking not for what should be there, but for what the snow's behavior revealed about what lay beneath. The wind had been consistent from the northwest for 8 days. That meant the south and east faces of any vertical structure would be partially scoured. The north and west faces would have accumulated catastrophically. She started toward Ridge Hollow with this model running in the background of her movement, interpreting as she went. Pharaoh kept pace beside her. He had said nothing since they left the cave, which she respected. He was doing the same thing she was doing, reading, calculating, preparing himself for what the town was going to look like. 30 years of construction knowledge organized itself into damage assessment before he had seen a single structure. The tension in him was not fear. It was the specific tension of a capable person approaching a problem larger than any of his previous problems. The church steeple appeared first, its top third, visible above the nearest drift, tilted 4 degrees from vertical. The drift along its north wall had piled to the eave line. As they came around the south face, the full picture of Ridge Hollow assembled itself in stages, each stage worse than the one preceding. The north end of Main Street was buried to the windowsills. 3 roof lines had collapsed. She could identify them by the change in profile of the structures, the way a building went from a defined shape to an approximation of one when its highest structural members gave way. The livery heavier, timber wider span than most had held. But the north wall had bowed outward under lateral drift pressure and would require immediate reinforcement before any significant melt load changed the force vectors acting on it. The schoolhouse roof had shed its snow load on the south side, which had saved it. The general store stood intact. The saloon had lost its false front entirely, which struck her as a fitting arithmetic, even though she did not permit herself to smile. Thresh's cattle operation, visible from the rise before the Main Street descent, was a different order of damage. The great barn, the structure whose cost he had cited to her, like a credential, had shed its roof in sections. The remaining walls stood in the morning cold, like the walls of something that had never been finished, open to the sky. The interior packed with snow to a depth that made the cattle losses she had already estimated from the sounds on the second day a confirmed certainty. She did not say anything. Thresh had taken a separate bearing toward his operation the moment they cleared the bluff base. She heard from that direction at a distance a sound she recognized as a man confronting the full arithmetic of what his decisions had cost. They found the first body at the north end of Main Street. He was one of Thresh's hands, a young man she knew by sight but not by name, one of the 2 who had gone back into the storm on the second day. He was in the lee of a collapsed fence, partially sheltered, which suggested he had known at the end that he needed to stop moving. He had the composed expression of people who died from cold, which was one of the small mercies of the biology. The systems that produced fear shut down before the systems that produced consciousness. Pharaoh crouched beside him for a moment without touching him. Then he stood, took his own hat off, held it at his side. The second of Thresh's hands was found an hour later by a search group that had organized itself from the cave survivors and spread across a quarter-mile of the south pasture. He had made it further than the first, which meant he had survived longer, which was not a kinder death. He was beyond the pasture fence on open ground with no shelter logic to his position. I had simply run out of the specific reserves a person could draw on when the specific reserves a person could draw on had been exhausted. 12 people died in Ridge Hollow and the surrounding homesteads during the 8 days of the storm. 3 were found in houses where the combination of cold penetration, chimney failure, and exhausted fuel supplies had produced conditions incompatible with survival. 4 were homesteaders whose properties were too isolated, whose structures were too inadequate, whose families were too small to maintain the fire-tending rotation a prairie blizzard required. 3 were people who had attempted to move between structures after the storm began. 2 were Thresh's men. Hester recorded each name in the notebook she carried. Not Josiah's, her own. The act was not ceremonial. It was the acknowledgement that each name represented a calculation that had come out wrong. Wrong structure, wrong decision, wrong moment of motion. The wrong answers deserved the same attention as the correct ones. Micah was found in the grain warehouse at noon. The door had drifted over completely and required 40 minutes of digging to clear. When it opened, the interior released a smell of cold smoke, burned pine, the particular staleness of a closed space occupied by one person for a week. He was sitting on a folded canvas tarp near the remains of a small fire in a tin pail awake, wrapped in every piece of fabric the warehouse had contained. He looked at Hester with the specific expression of a boy who had prepared several possible faces for this moment and was selecting among them. He settled on the one that was simply present. The fire had gone out that morning. He had been getting cold, he told her in the tone he used for statements of fact he did not want to inflate. She looked at the careful arrangement of the burn material, the systematic consumption of the wood supply, the way the space had been organized for maximum efficiency around a minimal heat source. She looked at the boy who had sat alone in a cold warehouse for 8 days and had kept the operational part of his mind running when most adults would have permitted it to go dark. You did well. He stood up. He tested his legs. They held. The 2 frostbitten toes had recovered function, which she assessed by watching him walk. He was steady. He looked at the morning outside, the brutal blue sky, the devastated town, the people moving through the drifts, with the particular purposefulness of survivors who had remembered they had things to do. She handed him a piece of hardtack from her coat pocket. He ate it. They went to work. The rescue and recovery operation ran for 4 days beyond the storm's ending. Hester organized it from the cave, using the interior as the only warm stock location within 12 miles that had come through the week as a resource rather than a liability. People who were healthy moved in rotating crews, digging out structures, checking on the isolated homesteads along routes she assigned based on her surveyor's knowledge of the terrain. People who were injured or exhausted or managing children stayed under Holloway's management, eating the ration meals, sleeping in the organized rows she had arranged, tending each other's frostbite with the specific attention Holloway had learned in a single day from watching Hester tend her own hands. Pharaoh's wife and daughter were reached on the second morning after the storm broke. They had held. The seal on the back room door had degraded on the 6th day, and the temperature had dropped to nearly 0. But the 2 of them had lain under every blanket in the house, pressed against each other with a copper warming pan between their hips, and they had held. Pharaoh carried his daughter out of the house on his back because her feet had frostbitten past the point where walking was possible. And his wife walked beside him, supporting herself against the sled Micah pulled behind them. The girl would recover most of the function in her feet. She would walk with a small hitch for the rest of her life. Nobody who saw her walk after that year ever mistook the hitch for anything other than what it was. Thresh worked with his surviving 4 men and himself as the heaviest labor crew, the one that went to the collapsed structures to excavate materials that would be needed for immediate repairs. He worked with a physical intensity that had nothing theatrical about it, the kind of labor a man performed when he was paying a debt he could not otherwise pay. He did not seek Hester's approval for what he was doing or ask for her direction, except when the technical question genuinely required it. This was the correct behavior. She acknowledged it by treating him exactly as she treated Pharaoh as a capable adult, executing an assigned function no more accountable to her than any other member of the operation. On the evening of the second day after the storm, Pharaoh came to her at the cave while she was reviewing the damage inventory she had been building since the morning of the clearing. He came in the manner of a man who had rehearsed something and then decided the rehearsed version was inadequate, so he would have to find it as he went. He sat across from her at the table. He put a carpenter's notebook, his own worn and bulging with folded papers, on the table between them. "I've been taking measurements since yesterday morning. I've been doing it all wrong, Mrs. Ainsworth. Not just the orientation, the entire philosophy of it. I've been building houses to resist the prairie. I've been treating the weather like an adversary to be defeated, and building walls thick enough to slow it down. You built a structure that put the weather on the outside of a problem the earth had already solved. I need to understand the principles. All of them. I need you to teach me." Hester looked at the sketches he had opened the notebook to. They were wrong in several details, but right in their basic orientation, the work of a mind that had genuinely revised its model rather than grafted new information onto an old one. The thermal mass principle first, then the orientation geometry, then the wind diversion. In that order, because without the first one, the other two are just carpentry tricks. He wrote that down. He wrote everything she said that evening with the scrupulous attention of a man who had decided that his prior confidence about what he knew was the most expensive thing he had ever possessed. Holloway came to her 3 mornings after the storm cleared, not at the cave, but on the main street of Ridge Hollow, where Hester was helping a crew shift a drift that had buried the entrance to the general store. Holloway waited until there was a natural pause in the work, which was a courtesy. She had a small green leather notebook in her hands, a fresh one, brass clasp on the front. She held it out. Hester took off one glove, took the notebook, opened it. The first page in Holloway's meticulous school teacher's hand read, "Principles of Earth Thermal Construction. Hester Ainsworth, Ridge Hollow, Dakota Territory." Beneath it, in smaller letters, "To be taught to be passed forward." The second page had already been started. Notes from observation. The temperature differential Holloway had recorded during her days in the cave. The orientation of the entrance. Questions she had formulated for which she did not yet have answers. Hester looked at the notebook for a long moment. Then she looked at Holloway, who was holding herself in the composed posture of a woman who had something to say, but had decided that the notebook said it adequately. Hester closed the notebook, turned to the first page, wrote 3 lines in the margin in her own hand. A correction to one of Holloway's temperature observations. A clarification of the underlying principle. Then she handed it back. "The thermal mass chapter first, before you teach anything else. The children will understand it if you start with something they can touch." Holloway took the notebook. Her expression was the expression of a person who had been carrying something heavy and had been permitted to set it down in a way that did not require her to acknowledge how heavy it had been. "I'll start on Monday." She walked back toward the school. Mayor Redmond came to her formally in his official capacity, which he reconstituted as quickly as the circumstances permitted, because men like Redmond understood that official capacity was what they had to offer, and they were most useful when they were being what they were. He came to the cave on the 4th day after the storm with 2 members of the town council and a proposal written in his careful administrative hand on a single sheet of paper. The town wished to recognize her contribution. The council had agreed unanimously. They proposed to name the North Road, the road that ran from Ridge Hollow to the Bluff, Ainsworth Road, in her honor. They also proposed a formal seat on the newly constituted Building Standards Committee, which Redmond was establishing to ensure that the county's reconstruction proceeded along principles more equal to what the territory's climate actually demanded. Hester read the proposal. She set it on the table. "The road should be called Josiah Road. My husband identified the principles that made this possible 4 years before I built it. He proposed them to the Union Prairie Railway in 1880 and was refused. He died before he could demonstrate them himself. The road should carry his name." Redmond looked at her with an expression that was attempting to navigate between respect for her wishes and the practical difficulty of commemorating someone no one in Ridge Hollow had ever met. "The townspeople know your name, Mrs. Ainsworth. They know what you did. They know what the cave did. I built it in the right place. Josiah found the right place. Those are different contributions, and the first one depends on the second. The road should carry his name." She folded the proposal and handed it back. "The committee seat I will take. There is a great deal of rebuilding to do wrong, and I would prefer to prevent it before it happens rather than correct it after." Redmond pocketed the proposal. He understood she could see that the negotiation about the road was not finished, that a man of his administrative temperament would find a solution that accommodated her wishes while also giving the town the narrative it needed. She was content with that. She was not interested in the narrative. She was interested in the building standards. Thresh came alone the following evening. This was at this point no longer a surprise. He had come alone to her cave in the storm's worst hours, come alone to the work crews across 4 days, come alone to the difficult things, because he was a man whose apparatus for receiving difficult things had always been private, even when his apparatus for avoiding them had been very public. He came in the late afternoon when the light on the prairie went the particular amber that made even devastated landscapes briefly beautiful. He stood at the cave entrance with his hat in both hands. The hat was his good hat, not the working hat, not the storm-battered wreck he had arrived in a week earlier, but the hat he wore to town on business days. The gesture was a language he understood. He had come to say something that required his best version of himself. I have been thinking about what a man owes when he has been wrong in a way that has a body count. He stopped. The stopping was not rhetorical. He was genuinely working through something, turning it in his hands, the way a man turned a tool he was not sure he was holding correctly. I said your work was a folly. I said it in front of people more than once for more than 6 months. I said it in the way that makes other people feel safe saying it too, because I'm the kind of man whose opinions give other men permission for their own. That is not a small thing. He looked at her directly. 2 of my men are dead because I built wrong, because I took pride in the thing I built instead of taking stock of what it could not do. I am not asking you to forgive that. I am telling you that I know what I owe. Hester looked at him for a long moment. What do you intend to do with it? Whatever you tell me is the right way to build. Then come to the committee meeting on Thursday. Bring your foreman. Bring your willingness to tear down the barn foundation and start again from the orientation up, because that site has a north exposure that will collect drift until you correct it. Thresh's men deserve structures that do better by them than the last one did. Something in his face moved, not quite relief, not quite grief, but something that occupied the territory between them. The place where a man located himself when he had said the true thing and been met with a response that treated it as the beginning of something rather than the end. He put his hat back on. Thursday. Spring arrived in Ridge Hollow with the abruptness that followed hard prairie winters, not gradually, not gently, but with an aggressive thaw that turned everything to mud and motion within a week of the first warm air from the south. The snow that had buried the county in sculptural forms came down in cascades from every slope surface, ran in sheets across the ground, found the creek beds and filled them to their banks with cold brown water. The town rebuilt. It rebuilt differently than it would have rebuilt without the winter of '84, which was the only thing that mattered. Pharaoh, working from the principles Hester had spent 3 evenings laying out for him in systematic order, began orienting new structures to the south, banking their north walls with compacted earth, thinking about what the wind did before he thought about what the lumber would allow. He was not building caves. The county did not have sufficient cave formations to generalize that solution, but he was building with the understanding that the ground itself was a participant in the construction, not a surface to be built upon, but a thermal system to be incorporated. By the winter of '84, 11 structures in the county reflected what Hester had demonstrated, not replications of the cave translations of its principles into the materials and terrain that were actually available. Dugouts carved into south-facing hillsides, sod construction with earth berming along the north wall, frame houses with the double-wall wool insulation that had been before the blizzard considered an eccentric extravagance. Micah came to her in April with a request that he had clearly rehearsed, and then in the manner of honest people abandoned the rehearsal for. I want to learn, not just help, I want to learn it properly, the whole thing. Surveying, construction, thermal principles, all of it. I want to learn it the way you learned it. Hester considered this. She looked at the boy, 16 now, something settled behind his eyes that the warehouse winter had put there, a quality of proportion between what he said and what he understood that she had seen in very few people his age. What I know comes from 2 sources. My husband's knowledge of the earth, my father's knowledge of wood. I can teach you what I have synthesized from them, but you will need to find your own 2 sources eventually, because what you build will need to be more than what I can give you. I understand that, but I need to start with what you have. She looked at him for another moment. Monday morning, sunrise. Bring something to write with. He came Monday at sunrise. He came every Monday and Wednesday after that, through the spring and summer and into the following autumn. He was not a passive student. He argued. He pushed back. He brought problems he had encountered in his own observation of structures around the county. He asked questions she had to think about before answering, which was the correct behavior for a student who intended to actually learn rather than simply accumulate what a teacher already knew. She found herself in those sessions revisiting Josiah's notebook with a different quality of attention. Not the devotional attention of grief, but the productive attention of a person who had to translate one man's insight into a form a third person could receive and use. The keel of the summer of '85 was a Tuesday in June ordinary in its temperature and light when a young man arrived in Ridge Hollow by the morning stage from Bismarck. He was in his late 20s, carefully dressed for the territory's conditions, carrying a leather satchel with the Union Prairie Railway's mark stamped on the clasp. He asked at the general store for directions to the Ainsworth property. Mrs. Hollis gave them with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had watched something go from embarrassing local eccentricity to destination. He introduced himself at the cave entrance as a surveying engineer 4 years out of the academy in Philadelphia, assigned to the territory's expansion planning. He had heard about the cave dwelling from a colleague who had passed through the county the previous spring. He had come, he said, because the thermal construction principles being applied in the county's rebuilt structures were beginning to circulate in the engineering literature, not yet formally attributed, not yet standardized, but present as a practical development worth documenting. Hester gave him the tour she gave anyone who came with genuine technical curiosity. The temperature readings, the flue system, the wool insulation, the foundation principles, the orientation geometry. He took notes with the rapid precision of a man trained to extract technical information efficiently. At the end, standing in the cave's outer chamber, with his satchel open on the flat rock she had used as a work table for 2 summers, he looked at Josiah's notebook, which she had brought out to illustrate the original thermal observations, and he went still. Ainsworth, Josiah Ainsworth. He looked up at her. I know that name from the archives. He submitted a proposal to the Union Prairie Railway's Engineering Division in 1880. Earth integrated construction for railway maintenance stations in cold weather territories. The board declined it that same year. He paused. I read it 2 years ago in the file room in Bismarck. I thought it was one of the most carefully reasoned engineering proposals I had seen from that period. The cave was quiet around them. The temperature was 13 degrees as it had been every day she had lived there, as it had been every day before that, for longer than anyone needed to count. Hester held the notebook. She did not speak immediately. She let the fact of what he had said exist for a moment in the correct silence. He knew it would work, he just did not live long enough to show it. The engineer looked at the notebook with the particular respect that people who understood technical knowledge paid to technical knowledge correctly applied. What you have built here, Mrs. Ainsworth, what you have demonstrated, what you have taught the builders in this county, it is what he proposed. You completed it. Hester put the notebook back on its shelf. Yes, that was the plan. She offered him the table for the rest of the afternoon to work on his documentation. He accepted. Micah arrived mid-afternoon for his Wednesday session and found the young engineer at the table copying diagrams, which he accepted with the adaptability of someone who had learned to expect that the cave would occasionally contain unexpected developments. He pulled up a stool, introduced himself, looked at the diagrams with the assessing eye he had developed over a year of instruction, and offered a correction to one of the thermal gradient calculations that was after a moment of checking accurate. Hester watched this from across the cave with the feeling of something that did not have a name but had a shape. The shape of a thing that had traveled from one person's mind, through the ground, through grief, through a woman's 2 hands, and arrived in another person's head, fully functional, ready to travel further. She lived in the cave for 17 more years. The territory grew, Ridge Hollow grew, the North Road called by general use, and then by official designation, Josiah Road, because Redmond had found a way, became a proper graded track that connected the town to 3 new homesteads, established in the late 80s. The cave remained unchanged in its essentials, though she added a second stall when Ember was joined by a younger horse, extended the root cellar by 6 feet in 1889, when a particularly productive garden season required the storage, replaced the original stove flue pipe, when it finally rusted through in 1893 with a heavier gauge pipe that she predicted would outlast her. Micah became what he had set out to become, though the form it took was not precisely what either of them had imagined in the Monday sunrise sessions of 1884. He did not become a builder in the way Farrow was a builder. He became something that did not yet have a settled name in the county, a person who understood structures and ground and the relationship between them at a level that operated before the drawings were made. Who could walk a piece of land and describe what it wanted to be built on it? He worked with Pharaoh through the late 80s, then branched out, then began receiving requests from counties that had heard about the blizzard of '84 and the construction principles that had survived it. He came back to the cave on Wednesdays for 4 years. After that, he came back whenever he had a problem that required the particular quality of thinking the cave produced, or whenever he simply needed to be in a place where the temperature did not change, regardless of what the sky was doing. Hester Ainsworth died in the cave on a morning in October of 1901 at the age of 52. The cause was pneumonia that had been tracking her since the previous winter, which she had managed with the same methodical attention she gave all practical problems until the point at which it exceeded what attention could solve. She had known it was exceeding that point for 3 weeks, and she had spent those 3 weeks doing the things that needed to be done in the order they needed to be done, which was the only way she had ever known how to operate. She organized the transfer of her survey equipment to Micah. She wrote a letter to the county records office, specifying that the cave property should be preserved in its current state, with a detailed description of the thermal principles that made its preservation meaningful beyond the sentimental. She brought Josiah's notebook out from its shelf and sat with it at the table for an evening. Not reading it. She had long since internalized every word, simply having it in her hands. The weight of it, the cracked spine, the water-stained covers, the small, precise handwriting inside that had started all of it. She put it on the table where Micah would find it. She had written on the inside front cover in the margin beside Josiah's name. He was right. It works. Pass it forward. Then she went to bed in the cave that held its temperature at 13 degrees, regardless of what October had decided to do outside, and she did not wake up. Micah Doverly was 34 years old when Hester died, established enough in his work to have a reputation that extended past the county, young enough to carry something forward for a long time. He arranged the funeral on the bluff above the cave, which was what she would have chosen because it was the correct site, elevated, oriented south, with a view of the cave entrance below and the prairie beyond it. Most of Ridge Hollow came. The 27 survivors of the blizzard of '84 who were still living in the county came. Some of them elderly, some of them accompanied by grown children who had heard the story enough times to feel they had been there themselves. Prudence Halloway, 70 years old, gray-haired, still teaching, stood at the graveside with the small green notebook in her hands, the one Hester had written the margin notes into on the street after the storm. She had filled that notebook completely by 1887. She was on her 4th notebook now. She kept the first one in her desk drawer and took it out occasionally, not to read from, but to hold the way Hester had held Josiah's notebook for the weight of what it contained. Barnaby Thresh stood at the edge of the gathering with his hat in his hands, the same posture he had brought to the cave entrance in February of '84, now worn smooth by repetition into something that was simply how he stood in Hester's vicinity, alive or not. He had rebuilt his operation 3 times since the blizzard, each time with better principles, the last time with Micah's direct involvement in the site assessment. The barn that stood now on his property faced south, was banked on the north with earth and stone, had a roof designed for prairie snow loads, and had stood through 4 hard winters without yielding anything to the weather that he had not been willing to give. Silas Redmond had retired from the mayoralty in 1892. He was present in the specific posture of a man attending to something larger than municipal record. He had never formally resolved the question of who should get the credit for the winter of '84. The cave, the woman, the dead man's notebook, the years of patient construction before anyone understood what was being built, and he had stopped trying. Some debts could not be paid in the currency of official recognition. They could only be carried. Micah designed the bronze plaque himself in the winter of 1901, sitting at the table in the cave with Josiah's notebook open beside him for reference. He had it cast in Bismarck by a foundry that did memorial work. He set it into the stone wall himself to the right of the cave entrance in the spring of 1902, with the same close tolerance work he had learned watching Hester set tenons into mortises on summer mornings 17 years earlier. The plaque read, "Rock built with grief, proven by blizzard, remembered by stone. Hester Ainsworth, 1849 to 1901. She did not fight the earth, she listened to it." Below the main text, smaller in the margin of available bronze, the way notations appeared in the margins of notebooks for Josiah, who found the place first. The cave stood as it had always stood. The temperature inside held at 13 degrees through the summers that followed through the hard winters, through the particular indifference of prairie weather to human arrangements. The stove Hester had purchased for $22 in the summer of 1883 was replaced once in 1912, but the bracket she had mounted the barometer on remained, and the barometer remained on it, its brass face green now around the edges, its needle still moving in the language of pressure that Josiah had taught her to read. On the day the State Historical Society installed its own marker at the site 40 years after the blizzard, the temperature inside the cave was 13 degrees. The temperature outside was 37 below. The differential between those two numbers was exactly what Josiah had calculated in his notebook in 1879, what Hester had built around in 1883, what the earth had maintained without assistance or interruption through everything that had happened in between. Some things built correctly in the right place, in cooperation with what was already there, simply hold. They hold past the people who built them, past the arguments about whether they should have been built, past the weather that tested them, past the grief that drove them. Micah Doverly stood at the cave entrance on the afternoon. The marker was placed and put his hand flat against the limestone wall. The same gesture Hester had made so many times, he had absorbed it without noticing the way students absorb their teachers' habits when the teaching was good enough. The rock was cool under his palm, patient, entirely indifferent to the decades that had moved across its surface. 13 degrees, same as it had always been, same as it would be. He stood there for a while, not thinking about any particular thing, just keeping his hand on the stone.